First, I'd like to thank the Taubman College of Architecture and Planning for the invitation to present at this conference, and Maclean Clutter for including me on his panel, aligning the role of history with contemporary architectural practice. I see myself neither a practitioner nor historian. I prefer the descriptor genealogist or presentist, since I'm interested in the design of history. For me, the priority lies in not whether contemporary practices use history or not. I think this is actually a secondary issue, but whether contemporary practices have the ambition to advance architecture as a cultural discipline in new and surprising ways. This might take place through a number of means, and history may be one of those means. But in this sense, contemporary practice's deployment of architectural history is not necessarily the legitimating factor of having a disciplinary project. Obviously, there are several ways in which architecture's discipline might be advanced. In the American context, my current interests are invested in how it may be advanced through the production and visualization of ideas and concepts, the productive domain of architecture and urbanism during modernism. By ideas, I don't exclusively mean singular visions or utopian images, but refer to those speculations, artificial constructs, and alternative worlds that we design, imagine, and invent to complement existing realities. While ideas seem to have become unfashionable in favour of presumed necessities or facts, the green, sometimes the digital, I'm nevertheless interested in developing a culture of ambition for them, not only from inside the academy, but across institutions, public genres, and audiences. So with these ambitions, and in this context, I want to return to the year of 1976 and look at an architectural exhibition that opened in Chicago, which represents a productive moment when ideas were on the table, where specific versions of architectural history intersected with professional practice, where designers fabricated alternative histories to clear space for ideas-based practices, and where the packaging of history enabled architectural ideas to reach a broader audience. In May 1976, two exhibitions about the history of Chicago's architecture opened simultaneously in Chicago. The first exhibition, 100 Years of Architecture in Chicago, Continuity of Structure and Form, organized by SOM architect Peter Pran and Chicago critic Franz Schultz, took place at the Museum of Contemporary Art as an expanded American version of Grube's 1973 Munich exhibition of the same name. This exhibition, which represented a chronological history of Chicago architecture as seen through the skeleton frame, presented the first Chicago Architecture School, the legacy of Mies van der Rohe, which came to be known as the Second Chicago School, and ultimately ended in a second then, which was then a contemporary generation of architects under Mies. In its chronological approach to demonstrating the lineage of steel frame construction, the exhibition ordered architectural history through the methodology of historicism. It was a linear, origin-based, unified story. The second exhibition, simply titled Chicago Architects, organized by a set of local practitioners, Stanley Tigerman, Stuart Cohen, Larry Booth, and Ben Weiss, opened in the lobby of Harry Weiss's Time Life building. Conceived polemically as a counter-show to the 100 Years show, Tigerman and Cohen both claimed that the former exhibition had excised alternative work from Chicago's architecture history outside the sweeping use of the skeleton frame, despite other equally significant architectural ideas having stemmed from the city, which ranged from pre-Venturi shingle-style architecture to post-war, to post-Prairie School vernacular. And so in this sense, the exhibition sought to showcase a narrow selection of buildings. They were largely houses, schools, churches, rather than corporate structures. And they were chosen primarily for idea and aesthetic merit rather than technological significance. Arguing that the city's architecture history was wider and more inclusive than the persistence of structure and form, the designers included a miscellany of projects by often overlooked Chicago architects, which included themselves, Bertrand Goldberg, Harry Weiss, George Fred Keck, Stanley Taubman, and so on. And these architects' work shared ideas or formal characteristics. That was the claim these designer curators made. In Craig Owen's terms, this non-linear reinterpretation and rearrangement of sources without a singular origin was an operation in genealogy rather than in historicism. The two exhibitions suggest that architectural history in a professional context can either repress or enable ideas. Taubman and his cohort clearly felt oppressed by the professional limitations imposed by a second-generational establishment of Mesians. Cohen admitting that the motives of their show were, quote, to rewrite history and to undermine a position of power that existed for Murphy and SOM and IIT. At stake in the counter-exhibition was, quote, retelling not just the history of Chicago architecture, but how the history had been written by Gideon and Pevsner and later by Grube to be one thing to the exclusion of another thing. The alternative history put forward, importantly fabricated by designers, was a prospective activity, an attempt to create the space for an alternate form of contemporary practice. As Craig Owens has suggested in another context, the goal of a Nietzschean genealogy, like modernism itself, was not to reanimate the past or to restore the past, but was fundamentally a clearing operation, an attempt to clear a space in which the new might emerge. And so for Taubman, Cohen, Weiss, and so on, revising architectural history was less about reasserting a neglected past, but rather an act of design, one that might open up the possibility for another architectural future, theirs. The significance of the Chicago Architecture Exhibition lies in part in the intellectual inventiveness of its curators and their attempt to develop ambition for an ideas-driven disciplinary project as an alternative to what had become, in Chicago at least, a normative environment of building. This reorientation, one that quickly mobilized into a broader platform for design innovation, with the formation by Taubman and his cohort into the Chicago 7 by December 1976, and the subsequent exhibitions and competitions that they instigated, bullied the profession and broader public into a foregrounded discussion of architectural ideas. And some of the examples of those were the Exquisite Corpse exhibition, which took place in 1977, the late entries to the Chicago Tribune Tower competition took place in 1980. The initial critique of how Chicago history was written expanded to a critique of how it was taught, with the most blatant attack coming from Taubman, who, offering one-way tickets on his version of the Titanic, called for the end of a professionally oriented pedagogy taught by Mesian copiers at IIT. In short, history was used by Taubman and co. as a means to produce alternative positions, rather than justify the continuity of a particular tradition, as might be seen in the more recent attempts to theorize contemporary practice, such as Patrick Schumacher's parametricism, a claim for stylistic evolution, even a new improved teleology from the Gothic through modern, a retrospective alibi for a genre of digital practice. The Chicago Architects Exhibition marks one of the last moments when an ambitious faction of architects sought to leverage history for the ends of professional space, engaging a wider audience for architectural debate. Previously, history and practice were more symmetrically related in professional trade journals beginning in the late 19th century, when a number of publishing venues combined historical and current content. Even, for example, Chicago's Inland Architect between 1883 and 1908 was introducing translations and critiques of figures such as Semper, or perhaps more famously, London's Architectural Review, where between 1930s and 1950s approximately, contributing historian critics defined the field with a range of polemics and design orientations. Pevsner, Hitchcock, Summerson, Banham, Rowe, just to name a few. Or finally, the proactive attempts at redirecting both practice and popular taste with arts and architecture in the 1950s and 60s under John and Tenzer. From the 1970s onwards, however, the professional journal relinquished its role as custodian of writing with history and for the future. While in some ways opposition served as an inspiration to the Chicago architects, after all, they named themselves the Seven in reference to New York Five, and as oppositions too, aimed at a history that was operative, engaged with practice, and with a range of ideas. From another vantage point, oppositions can also be seen as the beginning of what would become the more narrowly academic journal, unconcerned with redirecting popular audiences and increasingly engaged with critical approaches. With Chicago Architects, however, and one must say with Inland Architect, the magazine of that moment in Chicago, one can see an opportunity for architectural thinkers to be understood as designers of history, fabricating history for the purposes of gaining clients, gaining projects, gaining commissions. The general publicity surrounding the two exhibitions largely emphasised the conflicting notions of architectural history, teleological versus revisionist, over curatorial format. Indeed, very few reviews featured photographs of either shows. Across nearly all reviews, columns, essays or letters which appeared in newspapers, journals and magazines, among them Saturday Review, the New Art Examiner, Library Journal, Newsweek, Record, the debate was characterised as a fight through sensationalised headlines. Chicago's design war, war of ideas, Chicago's battle of architecture, confrontation in Chicago, battle of the buildings and juicy details, dogma eat dogma time, a head-on clash of ideas, born in belligerence, an attack on architectural history, a showdown between Miesian sheriffs and anti-Miesian outlaws, an architectural war of the worlds. Everyone, it seems, likes a good fight. The styling of two kinds of history enabled architectural ideas to be presented to a diverse audience in a riveting manner, the pro-con structure enabling ideas to be positioned within historical and conceptual frameworks, the sensationalized tone of a fight enabling the popular absorption of ideas, and the productive distraction of ideas themselves enabling local architectural conversation, in Chicago at least, to stray away from the pragmatics of building. For Taubman, the exhibition Face Off demonstrated that, quote, the world of ideas, not just the built environment, are not quite dead in Chicago, unquote. In short, the catalogues, reviews, letters and essays that surrounded both exhibitions amounted to a version of architectural culture that exceeded technology, practice and buildings to embody a cultural discourse focused around spectacle and disagreement, engaging the imaginative possibilities of a national and international audience across all genres of publication and styles of criticism. In our current moment, when architectural discourse is polarised between academic writing in theory history journals and descriptive reportage or non-specialist opinion in consumer magazines, the trade press, and many blogs, the Chicago Architects exhibition offers a counterexample of how history might pass through the terrains of academy, genre, and audience. That the exhibition articulated so clearly a position, that the position could be so easily packaged by the press, offers a lesson for how we all might make architectural ideas more lucid and compelling to a general public. The two exhibitions also suggest that on their own, history isn't enough, practice isn't enough, and nor even is combining them enough. As one could easily end with a 100 years show, a history of practice combined with business as usual. A discipline founded on the ideological projection of new worlds can benefit to solicit both history and practice and whatever else might come its way, opportunistically and to its own ends. In this way, the future of history might be productively formulated simply as nowism. Surely there's something to be learned from that 70s show. Thank you.